user account management. In this nugget, we talk about user accounts, and this time we're going to talk about some more specific items that we haven't really had time to look at before. That is, specific user account properties and attributes, if you will. Some of those little checkboxes, radio buttons, and all those types of things that you might have been a little bit fuzzy on in the past. Well, we'll talk about some of the specifics of those things. And then we'll also talk about specific account management, such as how we can do things such as configure a user's passwords policy, lockout policy, auditing, all those different kinds of things we'll take a look at in this nugget. Alright, we've talked about user accounts a number of different ways, and we've created them a number of different ways and everything, but there's still some things that we haven't touched on with specific user accounts, and I keep promising that I'll get to it, and now maybe finally I will. That has to do with the exact properties of a user account. So if I double click on Ben Grimm here, for example, and remember, this is very important for you to know, Ben Grimm is known as the Thing in the Fantastic Four, and if we go to the organization, remember, he's a member of the Fantastic Four. He's that really strong, rock-looking guy. Anyway, you have to know that in order to be able to be a good IT administrator. Anyway, here we have some characteristics, and these are all pretty well self-explanatory, so I'm not going to exhaust all of these things. But I am going to go through a few other things just to make sure that we got the bases covered in terms of what's available for a given user account. Here again, the address, I think all that is also pretty well a given in terms of knowing what all those things are. Here we have some things I will start to discuss, though. On the Account tab, this can be pretty important. Want to have a user logon name. Some of the time, you'll be creating user accounts, maybe using a command line method or something like that. And if you ever leave off the user logon name, at least in terms of the user principal name, and that's what this is. In fact, instead of saying user logon name, this probably should be named user principal name, because that's how you log on with an email looking kind of an address. Anyway, if you create an account and forget to put in this data right here, you can actually still log on anyway. It's kind of baffling. I don't understand why that has to be that way, but I've seen systems where this account was just blank here and there was nothing selected here at all either, and yet they can still log on using a user principal name. This is kind of the modern way of logging on, and using this, you won't have to also enter in the name of a domain as a separate field. Just enter in the whole thing on one line. If you want to use kind of an older method for doing that, you could use the NT4 method. That would be where you have the name of the domain followed by a backslash and then the name of the user. We still actually do use that. I shouldn't call it too old-fashioned because sometimes you'll still use this. But you could use these kind of credentials if you were connecting to, for example, a network resource such as a file share, and it was asking for credentials. If it does that, you might need to enter it in, this way as well. This is still, again, used in many different places. The other thing we could do is to enter in our logon hours, and I had touched on that in a previous nugget, so I'm not going to exhaust that, but here again, we can specify when a user is able to log on. So if we want them to have only, clerical hours, for example, maybe, Monday through Friday, between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., we might do something like that and click OK. Now, what would happen here is, if they happen to come in on, Saturday morning at about 8 o'clock, then they would try to log on. Actually, that's Sunday, isn't it? It's right here. They tried to log on at Saturday at 8 o'clock. They would just be denied that access. And that's what would happen. Here, however, if they're already logged on Friday at, I guess that's 6 o'clock, and then it goes to 6:01 on Friday, they remain logged on for that period of time. But if they were to log off and then log on, they would be denied access. Or if they tried to access a network resource that required reconfirmation of their logon credentials, then they would be denied access to whatever that network resource was. Okay, all right, so that's what we've got there. We can also have log on to. This is very useful if you want to make sure that certain users can only log on to certain computers. This is very useful, again, for example, if I have a temporary office employee, I only want them to use 1 or 2 computers, then I would enter in the computer name right here, and then even though they had a valid credential, they could not log on to any of the other computers within my organization. Now, if this is a locked account, then I can unlock that account using this checkbox here as well. And this is a checkbox you'll need to deselect if it's been selected. So if it looks like this, then the user will not be able to log on because their account's locked out. Even if they know their password and they're entering it in correctly, if it's been locked, then they won't be able to log on anyway. So I would have to clear this, and then using the correct credentials, that user could log on. Now, how does that get checked in the first place? That automatically happens if the account lockout policy has a certain threshold, let's say 3 incorrect logon attempts, and after that, if they attempt a 4th incorrect logon attempt, then it will lock their account out, and that's designed to prevent people from repeated password guesses, for example, especially for intruders. But once we have unlocked their account, if they enter in the correct credentials, then of course they will be able to log on. Then we also have some other things here as well. User must change password at next logon. Why would I want to have something like that? Well, if I reset the password for this user, and let me just cancel out of this for a moment. Let's say that Ben Grimm, he went to the, Friday afternoon, he reset his password to something that he thought he could remember. During the weekend, he went to the lake and killed a few brain cells. Now on Monday, he can't remember his password because apparently the brain cells that contained his password were the ones that got killed over the weekend. Anyway, we have to reset the password for this user, so we right-click on the user account and reset the password. Notice that if I do that, then it also gives me the user must change password at next logon and unlock the user's account. Then it would set this password right here. Now, as it relates to user must change the password at next logon, which launched this particular discussion, I will enter in the password right here, but then the user knows the password and I know the password. We're probably conversing on the phone, and we'll say, hey, what do you want to be the password? Let's enter in Wrigley's chewing gum, whatever. And we'll enter that in and then confirm it down here. And then now we both know the password. Well, I want to have plausible deniability. I don't want this user to say at some future point in time, hey, someone broke in and deleted my files or stole my confidential data or something like that. You know what? As I recall, the administrator knew my password. Well, not if we select this item, because then they'll log on for the first time, reset the password to something only they know. Now, another setting we would have here is the user cannot change password. And why would I want to do that? A number of different reasons. You might have a kiosk computer, for example, where you don't want a passerby to walk up to it, hit Control-Alt-Delete, and then choose to change the password and then lock everybody else out from being able to use that computer or that account, for example. So that would be one way to prevent it from vandalism, so to speak. Another thing that kind of similar to that would be the password never expires item. Why would you want to do something like that? Well, that could be useful if you have a service account. And a service account would be something that has the authority, an account that has the authority to start a specific service. Well, normally those services are going to run, 24/7 all the time, especially on a server, for example. And you don't want them, the password to ever expire, because if it did, then the service would also stop working. So normally for service accounts, you'll give them a really long and complicated password, and you'll choose that the password never expires. You can also store the password using reversible encryption. That's very unrecommended. Is that a good word? That's not recommended. I was an English major, but you can't tell by the way I talk sometimes. Anyway, I do not recommend that you select this checkbox. Why is that? Because what really winds up happening when you select that is it will, the account will work as usual, but when you log on, it will also store a reversible hash, a reversible form of your password on the local hard drive, and someone with the correct tools could then reverse encrypt it. That's what this says here, reversible encryption. Then they could be able to figure out what your actual password is. And we don't really see a whole bunch of need for this one anymore, but on some older Macintosh systems, you wouldn't be able to log on to the domain unless you had selected this checkbox for whichever users were going to use that particular Macintosh. And, we don't really see that much now because the current versions of Mac OS X don't really need that. Plus, a lot of people are actually installing Vista on their Macintosh computers since they now use Intel processors anyway. I have a number of my friends that actually do that, considering it myself, in fact. By the way, as long as I brought up Macintosh, I also want to point something else kind of interesting. This is just a little tangent. There was a Microsoft contractor who apparently had a really good job up at Microsoft, and Microsoft hires a lot of contractors instead of full-time employees. And this person was walking by the loading dock and happened to notice these Macintosh G5 computers being unloaded at the loading dock there at Microsoft. Well, he took the picture and apparently posted it on a blog or something like that and got quickly fired from his job. So I guess you got to be careful what you take pictures of. That could really embarrass you. Not nearly as embarrassing as those pictures of me when I was young and needed the money, but anyway, you get the idea. Also, we have some other items here as well. Let's take a look at a few of these other checkboxed items. Here's one. Account is disabled. Now, this is useful if a person's going to be maybe gone for an extended period of time, or they're a new employee that's supposed to start next week, but they haven't come into the office yet. Any account that I don't think is actually going to be used, I will disable that account to reduce the attack surface. That way, even if someone were able to correctly guess the password somehow, they would still not be able to log on if the account was disabled. A smart card is required for interactive logon. This is very useful if you have a smart card infrastructure, and you'd probably also have to have a PKI, which we'll talk about late in this Nugget series. A smart card is just the same size as a credit card, and it has a series of gold contacts on it that can store within it, in the circuitry there, a certificate for you. And this would require that you use the certificate on the smart card to be able to log on, and that gives you two-factor authentication, both something you know, such as a PIN or a password, as well as the physical possession of that smart card. And that would increase security substantially if you had that. It would also prevent people from being able to remotely attack your accounts, because they can't really do that over the internet or something, or log on as you over the internet if they don't also have your smart card. The account is sensitive and cannot be delegated. And delegation is the ability of one account to request something or access something on behalf of another user account. And that could, of course, be security sensitive, but you could select this checkbox to disable that capability there. And then you can use a number of different kinds of encryption for Kerberos. There's Kerberos Digital Encryption Standard, AES, or Advanced Encryption Standard 128-bit, and 256-bit encryption, this last one being the strongest of them. And then you can also specify to not require Kerberos pre-authentication. During a logon process, there's a pre-authentication that takes place to help to validate the authenticity of parties involved. This is normally a good thing. I can't really think of many good reasons to select this checkbox here, thereby disabling that. The only thing I can think of there might be compatibility issues if you use some other kind of a Kerberos implementation. Because Active Directory authentication does use Kerberos, but there are other third-party kind of Kerberos implementations out there that might not like this method for some reason. Another thing that's very useful here is this account expires item. Normally it's going to be set to never, and that's the default, but you could also end it on a certain date or time, for example. Maybe you've got temporary employees, they're only going to be here for a month on a special project, and you want that account to expire at the end of the period of time. That way you don't forget about them, and that's very likely to happen otherwise. We'll just forget that we even had those accounts. And then there's an account that's left vulnerable that someone could potentially be able to log in as and maybe exploit something. But by setting an expiration, we help to circumvent that kind of an event. Also on the Profile tab here, we can set up a profile path, and you've seen me do this before, but just briefly, I would set it up to a share, and normally it's going to be, whack, the name of a server, DC Nugget 1 in this case, and then profiles. I think I have a share there called profiles, and then usually it's going to be percent username percent. And then if I click on apply, then it's going to create a profile folder called ben.grim over on this server here. What is a profile, by the way? Well, that's all the characteristics of a user's logon. For example, here I am logged on as Ben Grimm, and if I set something up like a specific kind of a wallpaper, or if I set up some kind of a document on here, right here on the desktop, that's part of my profile. Any preferences that I select, if I decide to choose, black mouse pointer, or a specific screensaver, or change the start menu to my own preferences, all of those different kinds of things relate to my own user profile. And by the way, here I'm just remotely connected to a Windows Vista computer client, and I use this quite a lot in our particular nuggets so that I can show you multiple machines within one interface here. So anyway, that's one way I could do that. This profile path then would give us the capability to have roaming profiles, so that today Ben Grimm might be on Vista Client 01, but maybe he's filling in for, Reed Richards over on some other computer tomorrow, and so he wants to have his profile roam with him. What would happen then, and this is just going to be brief, is that the profile that gets copied up to this file share when Ben logs off of his normal computer gets copied up to the server. Then when Ben logs on to Reed Richards' computer, it will download the profile that was previously uploaded to this path and download it to Reed Richards' computer. That way Ben gets his exact same wallpaper, mouse pointers, color schemes, desktop shortcuts, or whatever. So that's all going to be included there. We can put in login scripts here as well, but this has kind of become obsolete in favor of group policy object logon scripts, which support both login, log off, startup, and shut down scripts. We also have the home path, and again, we saw me do this a little bit earlier, but here I could enter in drive H to point to a specific location as well. And DC Nugget 1, home, and again, %username %. And by applying that, we'll again see it automatically fill in with a given name. Now, what is a home directory and how is that useful? One thing you don't want users to do is to store all of their data on their local desktop. So we don't want them to store stuff in their own, actually more than just their own local desktop. It would be their documents. So in here in the documents, this is actually going to be in Ben Grimm's local documents on his local hard drive. This does not give me a way to centralize the data or to do centralized virus scan or centralized backup or anything like that as an IT professional. So now I have data that's out of my control. Well, with the home directory, we can instruct the users to save everything on drive H, and it will automatically put it into this share on this server, which I then have control over, and I can re-permission, I can virus scan, I can back up, do a whole bunch of different things like that. Now, some of the rest of these, again, are pretty self-explanatory and obvious, so I'm not going to elaborate on those too much. But member of, we can change their group membership. This is a pretty important item to keep in mind. We also have the dial-in permissions. This can be extremely complicated and is pretty far beyond our scope for the time being. However, here we can allow them access, for example, to dial in via a dial-up modem or a VPN or something like that. We can deny them access, or we can control access through the Network Policy Service network policy. This used to be remote access policy, but now Microsoft has changed the name. The overall function of it is pretty similar, however. This would allow the user or deny the user access depending upon whether they meet certain criteria. We can also verify caller ID. This would be mostly the case of something like a dial-up modem connection, where we want to make sure that they're only dialing from their home number. Maybe their home number is 623-555-0987. Okay. Well, what would happen then is if this user attempted to dial in and the caller ID shows up as some other number besides this one, then it would reject the call, and they wouldn't be able to dial in that way. The callback options, no callback is the default. You could also set by caller, and what this is going to do is allow the user to set up a number for the modem at the central location or the server room to dial them back at a specific number, or we could always call back to a specific number. Again, maybe it'd be their home number, for example, like that. So a few different options there as well. We can use static IP addresses and apply static routes if we have a given route that we want the call to go through, or the network traffic to go through there. Now, the rest of the things that I want to show you have to do with terminal services or remote control, so I'm going to go strictly right here to a remote control to begin with. This enables remote control. This means that when someone is in a terminal services session, I have the ability as the administrator to remotely control this user's session, and I can require the user's permission, or I cannot require it. And what would happen here is, if we had something like a terminal services session and the users doing their normal thing and creating documents and so forth, I could totally take control of their keyboard and mouse and really play mind games with them. It's quite entertaining, actually. And then you can also specify the level of control. You can interact with the user's session and take total control if you like, or you can just view the user's session and see whatever it is that they are doing. Associated with terminal services is also the terminal services profile. You can set up a different profile path and home folder for these users if you want to. And this might be the case if you want to differentiate from their profile and home directory in a terminal services session as opposed to an actual physical desktop logon session. And then we also have these here, the environment. We can specify a given program to start up at logon, and this is again in a terminal services startup environment. And here we can then specify maybe we only want this user to run a specific application. And if we do this, then they can only run that one app, whatever we specify in here. And we can also connect client drives at logon. That would mean that this user would have whatever computer they're using to log on with remotely through terminal services. It would show the local drives as well as the destination terminal services remote desktop sessions drives. Okay, so we could use both of those. The same with printers as well. And we can also use default to a main client printer if we want to do that as well. And then as far as sessions go, with this one we can disconnect or end a disconnected session after a period of time, so that we don't have people that have sessions that they open on a terminal server that they kind of just forgot about. We don't want them to be left open indefinitely, so you can specify a length of period of time there. Same with active session limit. You can give them a limited period of time to be able to use a terminal services session, as well as an idle session limit. If it looks like they went to lunch and forgot all about it, then you can disconnect them after a certain period of time. If a session limit is reached or a connection is broken, you can disconnect the user from the session, which allows them to reconnect and resume their desktop settings in exactly the same way they were at the time that they were disconnected. So any documents that they have open would still be open and so forth. Or you could end the session, which would then close the documents, close the applications and everything, just as if you were to do a start and then a log off like that. It's much like that. And then you can allow a reconnection from any client or from the originating client only. So, that's kind of a jet tour through all of the various items that you can configure for a given user's account. Now, I'm not going to elaborate on this much, but there are additional things that you can't actually see that are not visible right now. And if you go to View and Advanced Features, and then you go to that same user account, then you'll now see that we have a few additional items there. The published certificates, which we don't really have any right now on this system. We'll talk more about certificates later in this series. And we also have something here called the Attribute Editor. And what this would do is it gives you the just about all of the attributes for a user account. And you can, some of these are configurable so that you can open these up and then you can type something into some of these. Others are not. But if you wanted to be very granular and specific about some of the things that you could enter in, you could do that now because the Attribute Editor is visible since I've turned on the advanced features. Now let's take a look at some other things relating to managing user accounts, and those would start with the Group Policy Object settings. Now this is going to be getting pretty far ahead of myself because coming up in the next couple or 2 or 3 nuggets, we're going to be talking about Group Policy Object, but I have to show you some of this stuff since I'm talking about user accounts now. The first thing we'll take a look at there are password settings. Let's go ahead and see where we can access these things. They're going to be located under Features and then Group Policy Management. This is called the GPMC, or Group Policy Management Console, as you may have also heard of it. We're looking at the forest, and then the domain in the forest is nuggetlab.com. And then by default, all the password settings are stored under the default domain policy. Well, I think we looked at this a little bit in the past when we talked about things such as granular passwords and the like. Now when I clicked on it, it gave me this message, and that's just telling me that I'm only accessing the link of a group policy object and not the group policy object itself. That's okay for my purposes right now because if I right click on this and choose edit, then it will actually edit the policy itself. Again, much more about that in an upcoming nugget. Now here we have computer configuration, policies, Windows settings, and then we have security settings, and I'm going to pause here in just a moment to show you the full path here. And then we have password policy. Let me expand this out a little bit. So notice the path that we took here to get down here, and now we're at the password policy. And these are all the default settings for a Windows Server 2008 domain controller and domain. Let's go ahead and address what some of these are. First of all, there's the enforced password history, and this one by default says 24 passwords remembered. What's that about? What this is going to do is if I decide to change my password, maybe it expired today, it would be easy for me just to change it to the same password. I mean, what if my password right now is Coca-Cola? Well, it would sure be nice if I could just keep that same password. If I set this at 0 passwords remembered, then I could just indefinitely change my password to Coca-Cola over and over again, and that doesn't really give me much in the way of security. So with this, I'd have to change the password a total of 24 times, and then on the 25th time, I could go to Coca-Cola again. Well, that will take quite a long time when you take 24 passwords times the expiration of them, which is 42 days. So that would be a good length of time before we could possibly come back to that password. Now, the maximum password age is going to be 42 days. This is when normally users will see a prompt saying that the password is about to expire, and then they'll be able to change it themselves there. Then there's the minimum password age. This is 1 day. This directly correlates to the password history. What if I set this at 0 days? And I had this left at 24. Well, if I was really insistent on having the password of Coca-Cola, then I could just change the password 24 different times to some other thing, Sprite, root beer, whatever else I could think of. I happen to have a root beer right next to me, by the way. I guess that's why that came to mind. Hold on just a second. I got to take a drink. Anyway, so we can have we can have 24 passwords remembered, and if this was set at 0, then I could just go ahead and change it over and over and over again on the same day until I got to the 25th incident, and then I would go back to Coca-Cola. Then we can have the password length. 7 characters is the default. And that's not a bad length, but of course, the longer the better. And then we can also specify complexity requirements. This is going to require alphanumeric, upper and lower case, and special character types of password characters that we use. Also, with this kind of complexity enabled, you cannot use any part of your username in the password. So some people like to have a username of B Grim and the password of B Grim. That way it's real easy to remember. Well, you can't do that with complexity enabled. In other words, what really happens here is you can't use any more than 2 consecutive characters out of your username in the password itself. And then we talked about this one as well already. This is disabled for good reason because it's not very secure, but you could enable it if you had a compatibility issue somewhere. We also have an account lockout policy, which is not set by default. And what this is going to do, you can configure this so that if someone enters in the wrong logon credentials a certain number of times in a row, then it can lock their account out. This would help to prevent against things such as brute force attacks, where some people can computationally, or hackers, I guess they're not people, but hackers can use programmatic means to be able to do password guessing. And they'll usually run this up against some large dictionary attack or something like that, where they'll just constantly guess at a user's password. And if they can do this programmatically, they might be able to guess a password thousands of times per second even. So what we might want to do is to eliminate that possibility. And we could set up, for example, a account lockout threshold, first of all. And one of the common settings that's used is 3 lockouts, okay? 3 invalid logon attempts, excuse me. Once I set this, notice that it wants to automatically set these others. I'm just going to click OK here for now, and then I'll go ahead and explain those here in just a moment. But what will happen now is I'll get up to 3 invalid logon attempts. On the 4th one, it's going to lock my account. How long will it lock me out? For 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, I'll get to be able to try my password again. Also, the reset account lockout counter takes place after 30 minutes. So if I try to log on 3 invalid times, then I don't want to log on the 4th time and lock my account out. Well, then what would happen is if I would wait 30 minutes, then it would reset the counter back to 0. Okay, so this is just kind of the way that works. But it does happen to be the same length as the account lockout duration by default here anyway once you enable this. So it's kind of a moot point in a certain kind of way. What you could do is you might want to set this down to a lower threshold, maybe 5 minutes. And that way, the user could sit there and twiddle their thumbs and think about it and go to the coffee machine, and hopefully once they get a jolt of caffeine, they can then remember what their password is without it having gotten locked out from a number of different logon attempts. And so that covers our GPO settings for password and logout. Also, we have auditing that we can keep track of, and we can keep track of 2 primary things as it relates to user logons. One of those is the account logon. The other one is just a logon. And what's going to be the difference with all of these? Well, here if I've got a domain controller, and that's what contains my Active Directory and all of my user accounts, for example. And then down here, maybe I've got a little desktop computer, and here I've got where the user's actually logging on. Okay, that's my user. Okay, and then maybe I have a file server over here as well, which is a domain member, but it's not a domain controller. I'll just put file server here. What happens is this user logs on to their computer, but they enter in their domain credentials, and it sends the credentials up to the domain controller. When the domain controller allows or rejects that logon attempt, it creates an event log as an account logon. So an account logon event takes place on the domain controller. If this user is successful or unsuccessful, then we'll have a log on event take place on the local computer. So account logon really relates to Active Directory and accessing the Active Directory. Logon, just a normal logon event log attempt, event log message, will take place on the local machine. The same thing would happen if this user wanted to access a file or a folder over here on the file server. Well, what would happen here again is their credentials would get passed over here, and then credentials can get checked against the domain controller. When that happens, we have another account logon event that is registered in the security event log, and on the file server security event log, it'll have a logon event for this user here as well. Now, to gain access to the domain controller's policy, you go to the domain controller's OU, you right-click on the default domain controller's policy to choose Edit, and then we'll simply go here to Policies, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Local Policies, and then we'll park right here. Let me expand this out a little bit. To Audit Policy, where you see all the default values are listed right here. Now, in a lot of production environments, they will increase this beyond just success. For example, for the audit account logon events, yeah, I want to know when people try to log on, but I also want to know if someone fails a logon. Maybe I've got a brute force attack going on against one of my accounts, and that might show, 100 logon attempts in an hour. Well, those would all be failures, but I want to see if there's a pattern there that looks like someone's trying to, to hack into my accounts or something like that. So I could change that one to success and failure, for example. Account management would be where I want to create, modify, delete, or change the password for a given account, such as, user accounts that I might create or work with. Audit directory service access is useful for if I'm accessing Active Directory objects and maybe I'm changing permissions on Active Directory objects and things like this. Audit logon events is again something that we can do. That's more of a local logon, but that's as opposed to the account logon, which is related to Active Directory. But we can also look at this audit object access. We don't really have that defined by default, but if I enabled this, then it would allow me to see anytime someone accesses an object such as a registry key, a printer, like a shared printer or a shared folder, for example, or I could audit anytime someone accesses any one of those things. I could also audit policy change. And that relates to whether or not we've changed any of these three things under these areas, the security options, the user rights assignments, or the audit policies themselves. And this will tell me anytime someone messes around with those kinds of things. I can also audit privilege use, so that if I'm maybe a backup operator and I perform a backup job, then that will audit that I have created a backup job and done that. That might be useful if I want to see who's been doing certain things. Maybe someone's been backing up data that they're not really supposed to have access to, or they're backing it up during odd times when it's really outside of the backup window that they normally use, and I want to see if they're trying to abscond with data, that kind of a thing. I can audit process tracking here as well. And this relates to actual processes. This is a little bit programmatic in nature, so it's not really something that we use very often here. And then I can also use audit system events. And this will keep track of anytime someone, for example, shuts down or restarts the computer, or does anything that affects something like the system or security event logs themselves. Now to kind of confirm that we have that event logging going on, here I've gone down to the event log, and you can see where I am in this path right here. And we see that, let's see what I got, a log off event. This is that Ben Grimm account that did log off. So I'm able to log that type of activity now because of the event log settings that I configured. Finally, let's go ahead and talk briefly here about disabling accounts, enabling accounts, and renaming those accounts. Here, if I go back into my server manager, maybe I want to disable an account like this Ben Grimm account. Maybe that user is going to be out of the office for a good while, saving the world or something like that. And if I disable this person's account, then it will prevent anybody from logging on as his account, even if they use the correct username and password. So I'll right-click on this account, choose Disable the Account, and then if this user attempts to log on, even using legitimate credentials, then they're going to get a message here, the user account is currently disabled. And it doesn't really matter whether they enter in the correct password or not. Of course, I can enable the account by right-clicking on it once again, and now choosing Enabling that account. Also, I can rename an account here as well. So Sue Richards, if this person is someone who changed their name, maybe they don't like Sue, maybe they'd rather be called Susan, I can right-click on this and rename. And then I'll just call them Susan Richards. Okay. Once you do that, then it will pop open the rest of this dialog box, because you might want to make some of this match up. For example, here it still says Sue, so I put in Susan. Okay, Richards like that. And maybe Susan Richards here as well. Okay, and they think that covers it all. So now this would then change all of those elements within, or all of those attributes within this user account. In this nugget, we talked about user accounts, and we specifically talked about some of those account properties that you might have looked at in the past and kind of wondered what in the world those things are. Well, we talked about some of the details there so we could have a better scope of understanding for actual user account properties and attributes. We also took a look at account management itself, such as how to configure password policy settings, lockout settings. We do those, of course, with a group policy object. And we also looked at things such as auditing of the user's account, as well as how to disable, enable, and rename a user account. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.